Today, we are discussing a topic that many of the families I work with have navigated, and that's infertility and IVF. My guest is Michelle Streeter. Michelle is an infertility and IVF coach and the founder of thrIVF. Michelle lives in Charlottesville and is a mom of two. I asked her to come on to share advice with you all around caring for yourself during your infertility and IVF journey, and I'm so glad that she agreed to join me for this conversation. Before we dive in, I just want to note that everything that Michelle shares today is intended to be educational and should not be considered medical advice. Hi, I'm Allison Egidi, a pediatric sleep and wellness coach and a mom of two. I love to help parents find solutions. This is How Long Till Bedtime. Well, hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for joining me today. Luckily, my husband and I did not have any infertility struggles, but so many families I know have, and just in general, I think we all know so many families do. But before we dive into talking about how women can care for themselves as they're navigating infertility and or IVF, I just want to ask about your story because I always love to start by hearing what inspired someone to pursue their vocation.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be here with you. So my story, I feel like it started when we got married, right? Because you come off of that like marriage bliss, and we got married back in May of 2015 for anyone tracking the timeline, right? And we waited a little bit to start trying because we wanted, spend time just the two of us, but we kind of thought it would be easy, right? Like you just have sex, you get pregnant. That's how you have kids. Like that's literally what everybody tells you, right? And to kind of compound things a little bit, I grew up Catholic. So like this was God's way, right? Like I was then supposed to birth children for, for the church. And that's not at all how it happened. So we started trying in June of 2016. So we waited about a year. And we were trying, it was fun. And then a couple months went by and it was kind of like, okay, well, like maybe we're just doing it wrong. And so I started getting really intense about like all the like ovulation predictor kits and like tracking my cycle. And like I learned way more about my period than anyone ever wants to know, but maybe we should all probably know. And it's funny because like my default was like, oh, I must be getting this wrong, right? Like that it's, a mistake that I'm making here. And then it was actually my husband who was like, I think something might be up. And I was like, no. Like, it's fine. We're still doing it wrong. It's fine. And so he actually took it upon himself and he went and he got tested. And that's where we got our first infertility diagnosis. So our first infertility diagnosis was male factor infertility. He literally came home one day. It was like that fall. And he handed me this card. I remember we were standing in our guest bedroom of our old rental. And he was like, here's a doctor for you to call. And I was like, what? And I had this moment where I was like, what do you even say to someone? You like call them, you're like, hey, my like husband might have a problem. Maybe I have a problem too. I don't know. Can you test us? Like we're trying to get pregnant and have kids. Because society tells you like you're not supposed to tell anyone that you're trying to get pregnant and have kids because the joy is in the reveal of like, yay, we're pregnant. That wasn't our story. So I made that really awkward phone call, which I'm sure they're so used to at this point, honestly. And that started our path down fertility treatments and the testing and all the stuff. But for me, I think like the most pivotal kind of point and moment, although there have been many at this point, in my infertility journey was about a month before we started our initial testing. My sister called to tell me she was pregnant. And it wasn't unplanned, but it also wasn't like she wasn't expecting it to happen so quickly. Whereas like that's like all I wanted. And so there's just such duality there of her grappling with this news of her pregnancy and grappling with the fact that I was struggling because at this point I had opened up to my family about the fact that we were having a hard time getting pregnant and just like the joy of like getting to have a nephew and also not being like anywhere close to being pregnant myself. It was a lot. And after that phone call, I just remember sitting on the floor of our bedroom and just like crying my eyes out. And I started saying out loud all the things that I'd been thinking in my head. And all of those thoughts were things like, this is somehow my fault. I've done something to like upset God and the universe. This is happening because I didn't go to church enough. And I just had this like moment where I like was finally able to step outside of myself and go, whoa, what? Like, there's no way any of this is true. And I was like, I'm not doing it this way anymore. I'm so done putting my life on hold. I'm so done feeling like a victim of infertility that like, I don't know what the way is, but there just has to be another way. And so for me, I really was like, okay, cool. What does it look like to invite more joy and gratitude into my life and journey and start living my life again and stop believing that I have to wait to be happy because this now chapter that I'm in doesn't feel good enough anymore because I want to be in this next one. And just infertility has a way of like bringing up all your stuff too, right? Like I was like, well, maybe I'm just not meant to be a mother, or I'm not going to be a good mother, or maybe I won't even like it. So like, what if I do get like, it was everything. And so there was very much a journey of just personal growth, becoming, exploration, and just giving myself permission to be happy in a season that's honestly heavy with grief. And this was like even before we got into IVF, before we got into multiple losses, like all the things. And so that was kind of like what sort of like brought my heart into this process in a different way. And we ended up doing our first IVF cycle that summer following the testing and got really lucky that our first IVF cycle worked. So I have a 4-year-old currently and an 8-month-old. And the 4-year-old came, I'll say, quote unquote, easily, all things considered, right? We had an IVF cycle, we got a viable embryo, and we were able to get pregnant from that. And so we were able to sort of put a pause on infertility for a little while and just enjoy this new chapter and season of motherhood. And I did end up being able to find joy through the IVF cycle and was able to navigate things. Like we only had one viable embryo from that cycle, but I was like, this is it. This is our baby. This is, and there's so much evidence that shows that that's not necessarily true. And I was just like, nope, this is what I'm choosing to believe. And this is where we're going. And then we started chapter 2, bless it, a couple months into the pandemic. So the pandemic started March of 2020, right? We all remember that intimately. The clinics all shut down, right? They weren't doing treatments. And it was about that same time, like a couple weeks before the pandemic started, I got this pull because one of the things that happened when I started sharing my story during what I call chapter 1 of our infertility journey, which was part of me processing and finding community and not doing this process alone, people started reaching out and being like, hey, me too. I've never told anyone this, right? And people then reach out and would be like, hey, like our cycle worked or we experienced loss. And so I started like holding space for folks unknowingly. And I was like, I think I'm meant to do something with this. Like, I think there's something here for me. But I was like, universe, God, I'm not ready. Like, let me figure out my own ish and then I can help the people because your girl's still working through it. And so right before the pandemic started, I got this nudge and I was like, I think it's time. Like, I think it's time. And I actually reached out to, I don't know if you know Caroline Addington, but I reached out to her. She's a local coach. And I was like, hey, like, had coffee with someone this morning. They told me to connect with you. This is like the 3rd time your name has like come out of a human's mouth. And I'm finally listening, going, okay, universe, I see you. And she really was like the one that finally like sparked that permission to just like start, And so I opened up my coaching practice and I welcomed my first few clients through the doors. And then the pandemic shut everything down. And I was like, oh, Lordy, here we go.
Yeah, so I am actually curious, what happened during the pandemic for everyone who was in the middle of their infertility IVF journey? Did all of that come to a screeching halt?
It did. It did. I think some clinics like finished out cycles. I had one client who had her cycle canceled, which like was kind of coinciding with the pandemic, but also like her cycle just like wasn't producing the follicles like they wanted. And so they needed to start over, but they weren't going to start over until they opened who knows when. And it was a really hard time because there's a lot of like waiting and unknowns. And this pandemic just added like an extra layer to that for everyone, right? And like nobody was fine. And so like even the support systems that folks had were just like, it felt like they were all crumbling. And so it was a time. And I ended up continuing to work with two of those clients through the waiting of the pandemic, and we just kind of kept in touch until their clinics opened up again. And eventually that started to happen in late April and May, and ended up walking alongside them through those IVF cycles. But it was a really, really hard season. And like infertility is hard enough just like by itself. And so to add that to the mix was just something else. And it was a really interesting way to start my coaching business too, and really realize like how much support was needed for this community and how invaluable it was to have support and have someone in your corner who just like gets it. And then ironically enough, once the clinics opened up again, something inside me was like, I think it's time to try this again. And I was like, what am I doing? Why are we doing it this way? But I'm very much someone who just like trusts those intuitive heart pulls. And so in June of 2020, we did another IVF cycle because we didn't have any embryos frozen at that point. And that journey ended up being a lot twistier, longer. We ended up getting pregnant from our very first transfer with that cycle, but unfortunately it ended in loss at 8 weeks. And that was my first, like, I don't want to say experience with loss, because I think there's so many points of grief and loss and infertility that just don't get acknowledged enough. And I think even just getting diagnosed with infertility is grief, right? Because you thought this is how your life was going to go. And now you're at this crossroads where you're like, I don't know if I'm ever going to be a mother. And I think there's something really, there was a really beautiful parallel too there with the pandemic, because I think we all experienced grief from that too, because our lives as we knew them ended for an undefined period of time. And I think if there's something that's going to build empathy for someone going through infertility who hasn't experienced it, it's seeing all the feelings and emotions that came with the pandemic and going, okay, this is what infertility feels like in its own right too.
Well, there's so much that's out of your control.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Even with all like the science, the technology, and all the things, yeah, like there's still no guarantees. Like there's still so many unknowns, and frankly, like there's just a lot that we still don't know about the reproductive system and fertility and all of that. I think that can be really challenging too. So our second chapter really involved multiple losses. We ended up having to do multiple IVF cycles, and then I was like, I'm not ready to stop. So what do I need to do to keep going? And so I continued to invest in myself, invest in support. And those things made a huge difference for me, and just being able to stay in it, but also in a way that felt good, because I was like, I'm not putting an unknown number of years of my life on hold while I wait and see what's going to happen with this thing. I'm going to keep living my life, and I'm going to keep doing this hard thing that infertility is asking of me, because I'm not ready to stop. And I think that's something that's important too, is like being able to recognize where you're at with the process of like, do you want to keep going? Do you want to take a break? Do you want to stop altogether? And like not making ourselves wrong for that and allowing that to be okay, I think is really important too. And then this past summer, this past summer, 2022, July of 2022, we welcomed our second IVF miracle. And that pregnancy was a roller coaster in and of itself, because it just, didn't feel real at that point. Like being pregnant after 3 losses, you're like, well, this one's just going to end in loss too, right? And so it felt kind of wild to welcome that little one into our family, and to now be a family of 2. And that's been my journey and my story. And all throughout all of that, I have also been coaching women in their infertility journeys, holding space for them through loss, through IVF cycles that worked, that didn't work, through, the pandemic coming and going and still kind of being here, but like not, like all the things.
Yeah, as you're telling your story, I was thinking of the very first time I was kind of exposed to someone dealing with infertility or IVF. And I may have been married, but I was only a couple years out of college. And I was at one of my girlfriend's houses, and we were just having a glass of wine. And her friend called, who was a couple years older than us, who was married, and said, I need to come over, in a panic. And Megan said, oh, yeah, come on over. And she came in, and I did not really know her well. I think I'd met her a couple times in passing. And she walked in the door, and she had a complete breakdown. Like she was driving by, pulled over, walked in. And she just started to spill her guts to Megan, but I was a bystander there.
You're like, I was just there.
Yeah, they're doing IVF and how terrible it was. And she'd just been driving around for 2 hours sobbing because she wasn't sure if she could go on, but she had this really huge job and she couldn't tell anyone at work. And she was just telling us all the things she was doing. And Megan and I, who were not trying to have kids at the time, I just remember the look on our faces must have been like jaw to the floor, just hearing everything she was going through. Now, granted, this was quite a long time ago and maybe things have changed a bit, but it sounded terrible. Ultimately, I can't remember if it was that first go around or another. She did have one child, but she told us that night, she's like, I will try to see this through for one child and I am done. And she no longer lives in this country, but I see her online and I'm like, oh, she committed to that. She really only had the one child, but I just felt her agony and how alone she felt on the journey, that she was out driving and driving and driving and just trying to wrap her head around whether she could even finish
Yeah.
that initial cycle.
Yeah, and I wanna tell you, like, "Oh, it's changed so much since," like, I think that still encapsulates the experience perfectly. Like, it's such an emotional roller coaster. There's so much uncertainty, there's so many unknowns. It really does bring up all of your just stuff. Like, it just makes you question everything. It makes you question your worth, your purpose. Like, if you've gotten things wrong, like I talk to so many women who just feel so much shame and regret and who, like me, blamed themselves. Even if, like, the ironic part for me was when we initially got our diagnosis, my husband technically had the medical diagnosis. It wasn't even me. And I was like, oh no, this is definitely my fault. And eventually we went on to also get a recurring loss diagnosis, which added a whole other layer to things. But like, so many women do that. And part of it is, I think it's how we deal with the unknowns and uncertainty. We're like, we don't know where to put this, so we put it on ourselves. And I'm sure you see that in motherhood too, right? Like, and I think just reminding folks too, like, you're not alone in that. And also, like, it's not your fault. And just, it's really not your fault. But also, it is hard and it's allowed to be hard. And I think that's the other thing too, is like, I talk to a lot of women too who are like, I should be able to handle this. I should be able to figure this out. And they're like, why can't I? Why can't I figure this out? I can't. And like I said, so many parallels between this and motherhood. It's just different seasons.
Well, I think along those lines, I remember this gal was talking, she had a huge job and a big marketing job. And as she was talking, you could kind of hear the underlying theme was something that I think a lot of us experience in motherhood is anything I've ever wanted, I've put my mind to and I've accomplished it. So
Yes.
why is this not the same? And so suddenly it felt like for her, I could see her thinking like I'm doing all the things and it's just not working. It's not coming together. And so I felt that way becoming a mother. I always say it was like the most humbling experience of my life because I prepared as much as possible and you realize, yeah, you just became the CEO of a company that you've never worked for in an industry you've never been exposed to. And it sounds like this is just a huge blow to that type A, I'll put my mind to something and I'll accomplish it.
Totally, for sure. And I see that all the time with my clients too. And I think something else there though too is like, I think it's easy in hindsight to look back and go, well, I've accomplished everything that I wanted, or like it all worked out really great for me in the end. But that's not to say that we each haven't had hardships or experiences where we were like, that didn't go as I planned, right? Or like maybe you didn't get the promotion, or, when you were in grade school, like you just didn't get the grade that you wanted and you were like, it's root, right? Like, and I think being able to recognize that the story in hindsight looks so different than the story in the moment, right? And I think like that's what we forget because we're comparing a story in the moment to, well, look at how all this worked out for me. And what's to say that it won't work out great for you in the end? It might not look at all what you had planned, but like we're still allowed to believe it's all going to work out for us. And that's honestly a personal belief of mine that I was like, okay, this is going to work out. It's going to be better than I can imagine. Like it has to be. I don't know what that's going to look like. It could be kids. It could be not kids. It could be finding myself, my purpose, whatever, like something I don't even picture. And that's a big part of like what I end up doing with my clients too, right? Of like, how can we learn to be happy and like create lives we love without having to rely on the external circumstances? And I think that's the big kind of like reveal moment that so many of us have of like, oh, I've just been putting my happiness on literally achieve result, achieve result, achieve results. And like, I have no control in that.
Right. And everything in between is our life.
Right. And that's the part that we're like, well, put that on hold until result. And it's like, what if we get to just enjoy the life? Then and the journey gets to be just as joyful and exciting as everything else. And that like is a kind of a radical concept, but like it really just changes how you experience both infertility and our lives, honestly, because when you're like, oh, I can control the little daily joys, speaking of self-care through infertility, and it doesn't all have to be about the big thing, you're like, oh, joy is available here right now. How cool is that? And for me, that was like such a game changer. And it has been for so many of my clients too.
Yeah. So you mentioned in your story, it sounds like kind of the first struggle was the mental chatter that, the chatter of what is wrong and what am I doing? I'm curious, was there any other big surprise that came to you, either related to your mental health or your physical health and the journey that you just really weren't expecting?
I think the hardest surprise was the like emotional piece and the mental chatter, but I also think like just learning how much we don't know about our own bodies as women was kind of like shocking to me too. Like I feel like I now have a really decent understanding of kind of like how our cycles work, like what's happening with our hormones at each part of the cycle. And I'm like, nobody taught me this. They literally were just like, don't have sex or you'll get pregnant tomorrow. And I just thought, oh, we can get pregnant at any time of the month. And like, I'm just going to birth children until I either stop having sex or I'm like on permanent birth control. And even that's not safe. Like, and so realizing like how kind of miraculous even getting pregnant is to begin with all the things that have to come together and align perfectly, like that was like wildly mind blowing to me. Not necessarily in like a struggle way, but just like, whoa.
Yeah. I felt that a little bit after I got diagnosed with my autoimmune disease and I started to kind of dive down that rabbit hole. And then I went the path of functional medicine, and they're all about learning all the things about your body. And now it's like, wow, how did I ever operate not knowing all of these things about myself? And how is everyone else just walking around not knowing all these things? And meanwhile, my general doctor's like, I don't know what you're supposed to do with all those things. I mean, it is fascinating what we don't know about ourselves.
Totally. And I think the other thing too is like it just for me personally, because of the work that I was doing and this was before coaching. This was kind of like my exploratory personal journey rabbit hole. Like I also just had so much more self-awareness of like how things were impacting me and that mental chatter and my mood. And so even things like social media, for example, and like when social media was really helpful versus when it wasn't. So like for example, in chapter 1 of our infertility journey, I found a little Facebook community that was really active and it was very intimate. And so it felt safe to share in there. And I really connected with the women, and that felt really good. When we started experiencing loss in chapter 2, I had to be really careful about what I was consuming related to infertility and IVF, even as a coach. I was coaching simultaneously. And it's funny because I didn't really find my clients to be triggering, but I couldn't just go on the internet and start reading stories because that just created all of these like terrible what if scenarios that I didn't need more of because I already was personally excellent at creating worst case scenarios, as many of my clients are. And just recognizing that like even just kind of cutting off parts of social media or unfollowing parts of social media was so beneficial for my mental health. And I think that that's true for all of us because we all naturally start to either compare or assume that our lives are going to look like whatever story we're seeing or reading. And when our brains are in doomsday thinking, they're looking for all the evidence of ways that it can go wrong. And I'm like, I did not need more examples of ways that things could go wrong. But on the flip side, right, social media can also be a beacon of hope. You can be like, oh, this person went through multiple IVF cycles and multiple losses, and they have a baby because of it. Like it's still possible for me, So it again, and it's sometimes like a day to day, week to week, month to month of like, where am I at today? Is social media going to be helpful or harmful? Let's like check in and step back or step in depending on what I need today. And even just having that like I was living my life sort of on that autopilot of like goal, execute action steps, goal, execute action steps. And now it's like there's just this more intentional like curation almost, but like curation sort of breeds us an image of perfectionism that it's not. Like it's messy, but it's just like play and experimentation and like cool, what do I want my morning routine to look like today? What's going to feel good for me there? And just really allowing it to be guided by me and what I needed, not what I was supposed to be doing or should be doing or, like how it was expected to be, if that makes any sense.
It totally does, that intentionality. Yeah, that kind of lends itself to one of the questions I wanted to ask you about is, were there things when you were on this journey, things that you had to kind of remove from your plate, either activities or mental load or things that you just had to let go of? And it sounds like maybe social media or searching the internet was one of those things that you really had to be thoughtful about as far as your kind of mental health and survival and your mindset as you went through. Is that fair to say that that was the big one you had to watch?
Totally. Social media was a really big one. The Google rabbit hole, not helpful. Like it's just so easy to just go down those spaces, right? I can't tell you how many like baby center threads I was reading to like the very last comment, like, and it like wasn't helping. It was either giving me like very false hope so that I like felt very disappointed when a thing happened, or it was like, all the doomsday imagery, right? And then like something I have to talk to a lot of my clients about too is like not taking on the stories of other people because we get so wrapped up. Like people share their journeys and it's such a gift because it makes you feel less alone. And if you're not able to put that like boundary of like, I can recognize this person's story and I can witness them and I can appreciate it, but if I start taking on those emotions as my own, if they experience heartache or loss, like not helpful, especially when you're also trying to navigate it yourself. So that was definitely a big one. I also think like boundaries with work is a really important one too. And in some ways I got kind of lucky because when we were experiencing all of our losses, most companies and businesses were remote, right? And I was fortunate enough to be someone who was able to be remote, even though my partner at the time wasn't. But like, I like if I needed to sit at my computer and cry for a while on a certain day, I could just turn my camera off and do that. And like that spaciousness was valuable and important. And so I think too, there's a piece of just figuring out like, what do you need? Like if you work in an office environment and you don't have your own space, where can you go? Where are your kind of safe spaces and the processes and things that you can add into your day? And they don't have to be big. They can be small and simple, right? Like just check-ins of like, what do you need to feel a little better, to feel sane, to give yourself space to like have an emotion, right? Because like it's really hard when what we do is like we put that emotion on hold and then we put that emotion on hold and then we put, because we're like, it's not the right place, it's not the right time, it's not the place. But then eventually we're like, okay, there's way too many emotions packed into this little like bag or closet, or I don't want to open it because I'm not going to be able to handle it's just going to like pour out, right? But in the meantime you're like, ooh, close, I got this. And yeah, I think like it's okay to be a human at work sometimes too, and it's just about knowing like where's the safe space for you to do that.
Absolutely. And it sounds like you really had this shift where you said, no, I'm not going to approach it in this manner and I'm going to take a different approach. I'm going to find joy. I'm curious, was there something you read, saw? Was there some inspiration or was there a different practice that you incorporated into your life? Like what really allowed you to make that shift or inspired it?
That's a great question. I really do think that like saying out loud the things I was thinking in my head clicked something for me because I didn't know, I wasn't conscious of these like thoughts that I was having. And I didn't know to be conscious of them. I will also say this was like short, like I started my infertility journey close in line around the time that I like was a Beachbody coach too. And one of the things that they like talked about a lot was personal development. So I was actually reading a lot of like personal development books. I had started listening to podcasts. I actually also had a calligraphy business at the time. I've done all the things. I had a calligraphy business at the time too. And I was learning a lot from those experiences of just being a small business owner, of coaching women on their health journeys. And it's funny because like those things didn't necessarily like click and translate right away. They were in like a bubble. But then I had this moment where I was like, oh, I can apply this more broadly. Right. And so, but for me too, it was also about the realization of like, what is authentic to me. And so the biggest thing and realization that I had was I'm someone who's like a very open book about things that are happening in my life and sharing like the journey. That's like very part of my process. It's why I was ultimately drawn to being a Beachbody coach. It's how I started building my calligraphy business. It's like why I ended up working in higher education for 10 plus years with college students, because it was guiding them along in a journey using mine as a reference, right? And hence why I'm here now as an infertility and IVF support coach. And the thing that I wasn't doing with my infertility journey and story was sharing it. I was keeping it to myself. And there was this huge part of me and my life that was like hidden and blocked off from the world. And I didn't even really know why, other than society says you're not supposed to talk about it. Right. And like, I was like, that needs to change. And so for me, it kind of started with sharing my story and sharing my journey. And this isn't the way for everyone. I think that's also so important to say. It's just like figuring out what's authentic to you and feels right to you and unraveling it from whatever the societal stories are of like how it's supposed to be. That's what made the big difference for me. And so even just recognizing like just something clicked finally. And I think that that's like the beautiful thing about coaching too, is like having another human, right, who can like help make that click sooner, because my click was sort of like to the whims of the world of like one day it finally clicked. But I like know that if
I don't think it did though, because you just mentioned that you had been doing kind of the self-development,
True.
which listen, I love a good podcast, book, or whatever, just to make me
Yeah.
think. And so you maybe didn't have a direct coach, but you had been putting all of this stuff in, and then you were able to piece the pieces together. So it doesn't sound like it really came out of nowhere. It came from your years of
Totally.
curiosity and learning. And that, I just think that's one of the greatest ways to approach life, is to stay curious about stuff, because you'll
Yeah.
never know when you're going to need it. That's how when I got my autoimmune disease diagnosis, it's because I had talked to two people extensively who had two different autoimmune diseases, and I just like heard their story and I kind of looked into it. And right when I got it, I'm like, oh, I know where I'm going to head with this. I know which direction I want to go. And so I think that's awesome that everything kind of leading up to it set you up for this big shift and ultimately to launch your business.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a part of me that's like, man, I could have like saved myself a lot of headache and heartache in the process. And I also know that it happened in a way that now serves me, right? Because I like understand that struggle and process too. So
Oh, totally. And
yeah,
you couldn't coach people through it if your journey was perfect.
right.
I mean, that just wouldn't
I want
work.
to meet the mythical unicorn whose journey has just been perfect.
That's right. So, in your coaching, what do you find is the biggest struggle that women are generally facing during their journey? Is it the fact that they feel like they should be keeping it to themselves? I'm curious, when women come to you, what is that big like, "Oh my gosh, I have to talk to someone about this."
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, it like has slightly different flavors to it, but I really think the biggest thing that folks come to me with is just like feeling really alone and like no one gets what they're going through, and just like the isolation of that experience like is enough to make you feel like you're going crazy. And like some of it is like there's guilt or shame or regret that's driving them to not feel like they can talk about it, and they're worried about friends or family and how they might respond to them if they find out they're doing fertility treatments. For some of them, they feel terrible because they're like, I have really great friends and family who are nothing but supportive and it still doesn't feel like enough. What's wrong with me? Right? Or like, I don't want to be a burden on them because they've already given me so much. And so it kind of like brings up all this stuff around like boundaries, receiving, like self-worth. Like, am I allowed to be this supported? Like, don't I have to like work for it? I know for me too, there was like an underlying like proving energy of like, well, if this is the universe telling me that I'm like not meant to be a mother, then let me prove that I really want this and that I am meant to be a mother. And then it'll reward me. And like, this isn't about deserving. Like, none of this is about deserving, but we tie those things so closely together.
Yeah.
So those are the biggest things I would say that like folks come to be with, but it's that like loneliness and just wanting to be like witnessed and seen in this process and experience, because so much of society like really doesn't acknowledge the grief of this process too. And Brene Brown talks about this as disenfranchised grief. Like
Mhm.
we know to grieve certain things, but then when it comes to things like infertility or even the pandemic, like we're like, well, you just get over it. Like it's fine, just pick something else. Or like, people will say things like, oh, just do IVF or just relax and it'll happen. And that just feels so invalidating to a human that's like, I'm not relaxing enough. Like that's why this is happening. Like who's already like spinning out and blaming themselves. Um, and
Totally.
and I think just like a reminder that you're not crazy and you're not alone is like such a gift in this season.
Right. Yeah, so if someone's listening and they are really at the beginning of their infertility journey or about to start IVF, what would be your best piece of advice? I know everyone's going to be unique, but one thing you'd say, okay, when you think about taking care of yourself during this journey, what would be the one piece of advice you would give someone?
Mm, gosh, my biggest piece of advice is just like, don't do this alone. Like, find someone who can be there for you through this process, whether it's like a coach or a therapist, but it can also be a best friend, a support group. Like, there are so many resources out there now. There's still not enough. I feel like this community could always use more love and support and encouragement and seeing, but just don't do it alone. And I think that's the mistake that I made for so long, is that I stayed silent about it. I didn't even think like it was something to reach out about. I was like, oh, this like, whatever. And then it was like, oh, this feels like it's too much at this point. And I think like we sort of play this game of chicken with ourselves where we're like, oh, I can handle just one more cycle or one more transfer or one more appointment. And we do this in all parts of our lives. This isn't just specific to infertility, but if you're someone who has a tendency to do that, which I would say like most women do, like don't do that. Just like cut it off like one next time earlier and just see how that feels. And I think that can make a huge difference.
Yeah. And for your general self care or caring for yourself, whether it be mentally or from the physical toll that IVF can take on you, now that you've gone through this multiple times, two successful babies, but also multiple other IVF rounds, what was the best thing you did for yourself? You mentioned being open and being authentic, but as far as just caring for yourself, were there certain practices that you took on that were helpful?
Yeah, so there were a couple of things that I did. So one was making sure that I was staying true to myself, right, and being authentic and sharing my journey. And honestly, that looked different in different chapters and seasons. And so I was willing to like
Mm.
modify that. Like sometimes I was like, here's everything, and sometimes I was like, I'll share an update when I feel ready to, right? And I think too, giving permission to do it that way as well. Another big piece for me was support. I invested in having support. I had a space that I could go to, that I could be witnessed in whatever I was feeling without judgment, that I could really mostly just be witnessed in, is what I knew I needed and wanted. And I allowed myself to have that. And that was so invaluable. And really allowed me to keep hope alive and keep going when I knew that I wasn't ready to stop. But then there was also little things. So like adding like little joys into my day. So like I remember so clearly how different my mindset was with our second IVF cycle, which ended in 2 losses, and then our third IVF cycle. And the biggest difference is that I was doing my mindset work and like paying attention to those thoughts. When I did my second IVF cycle, my ego almost kicked in because I was like, oh, like I've done this before, I've got this. And I just remember hitting like a wall on like day 8 when the doctor was like, oh, we're going to keep going a little bit further. And I was like, I don't think I can keep going. Like, this is too much. And like, I think too, just like sharing that, because even if you've done IVF before, your brain might be tempted to be like, oh, well, like I've done this, so like I don't need support, but like you might want it even more at that point, right? Even if you've had success prior, like we had. So, and I actually even hate using the word success, because that's like, you're not a failure if your IVF cycle doesn't work either.
Right,
Like
right.
the language is so important there. But like finding little joys in the process too. So like with my third IVF cycle, I remember I bought some cookies. Oh my gosh, I can't remember the company, but I think it was from Found Market, which is a local Charlottesville company. And they have these little shortbread cookies. And I bought myself like a jar of cookies. And actually, it was really sweet. My sister was like, let me buy the cookies for you. And so after I did my shots each night, I like had this little ritual where I would go get my shortbread cookie and just like celebrate that I had done my shot. And honestly, those little like things, those little rituals that just brought me joy, grabbing a cup of coffee after every single IVF appointment from another local coffee shop that I love, like that made the process feel better and bearable. So I think like that alongside support were like the two biggest pieces that really allowed to keep my mindset in a good place and for me to continue to stay aware of what I wanted and needed in terms of next steps in my infertility process. Because, at one point our doctor came to us and she was like, it might be time to start kind of like looking at more sort of like out there practices that don't have as much like research behind them or even looking into surrogacy because like she just was like, I'm not really sure what's happening here. And we're already kind of like doing everything that we know to do. And so yeah, those little things are what's going to keep you sane and clear. So you can be like, okay, this is what I want to try next. This is where I want to go next. So you don't feel like you're just constantly hitting your head against a wall.
Absolutely. And maybe your husband doesn't want to be roped into this, but I'm curious about his side of the journey. So I'm imagining as he's watching you struggle, he's thinking, oh my gosh, this is my fault. And so, how did he care for himself? Because I bet men are talking about it even less than women. And they just aren't as usually, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but not as open with their friends like we are. How did he navigate caring for himself in this journey?
Yeah. So I feel like in some ways he's like maybe a bit of a unicorn in that he actually has like a counseling background. He has like also he's now in the medical field. So he just has a lot of perspective there. And so I actually think that when he got the diagnosis, he wasn't one to internalize that, even though I know a lot of men are. And I've had a lot of conversations with folks in the space where people do feel like it's their fault and they blame themselves, right? Like the same way that I was doing the same.
Yeah.
He's not really like that. He's a lot more like practical. He's not as like spiritual as I am. So he's just like, yeah, like crap happens like that, it just it is what it is. And I'm like, what do you mean that can't be, it has to be happening? Like what? Right. And so I actually think that we're a really nice balance for each other there. But of course, he also like felt bad that I was like struggling so much and that he wanted to like support and help me like our partners do. And also, I think he's kind of learned like I need to just let Michelle have her moment. But some of the ways that he supported me was by saying, yes, go get the support that you need. Like I like, you have my blessing, even though like I didn't need his blessing, but like, you have my encouragement and support there. And I think just recognizing like he didn't need to be my everything is such an invaluable way for partners to support each other in the process, right? Like when we're not asking our partner to just like hold everything for us and we're getting the support and taking care of ourselves in the way that we need, and they're doing the same, then when you come together, the relationship just feels so different. And then all the conversations don't have to be about infertility. And something I've also found too in talking with clients is like, when we learn to make space for ourselves and our emotions, we create space for our partners to have their feelings and their emotions, right? Because I've talked to so many clients too who were like, I didn't feel comfortable having all the feelings I was having. So whenever my partner had feelings, I was shutting those down because I was like, well, like I can't, like I can't. Whereas I've now worked with clients too who their partner was the one like always staying positive and being like, we got this, it's gonna work out, it's gonna be great. And they're like, stop it. I need you to not say these things. And then by the end of our time together, they're the one being like, it's gonna work out, it's gonna be great. Like, don't worry, we've got this. So it's just like fun too to like see that switch. But I really do think that that comes from just like making space and investing in yourself and like whatever that looks like and needs to be for you.
Totally. Are there I know there are not enough resources for women, but I am curious, are there resources for men who are struggling and who aren't unicorns like your husband?
Yes, there are. There's not as many, that's for sure. But I know that there's a lot more like the Instagram community is growing with folks who are interested in supporting men in this process. I think that even Resolve, which is like the National Infertility kind of like association, has support groups specifically for men, if I remember correctly. And so it's growing, but it's like in the same way the conversation around men and mental health is like, decades behind the conversation around women and mental health, the infertility space is very much a mirror of that. But they're there. And if people are interested in joining the conversation, they should come in and help, because that's right. How we grow it is like by sharing our stories, by connecting, by opening up and finding that community.
Absolutely. Well, this has been so helpful, and I really appreciate your time. Is there anything else related to women caring for themselves during this infertility and or IVF journey that you think we should touch on that we haven't yet, or any final thoughts you want to share on this topic?
I think the biggest thing that I want to share that I actually think is kind of like a universal lesson for all of us, whether we're struggling with infertility or not, is like at the end of the day, like it's safe to trust yourself. So like if something feels off or wrong or not for you, even if it like doesn't make sense, like you get to trust that and trust that whatever path you're on or going down, as long as you're following like that heart pull, that intuition, that is leading you to like your best good thing, right? And I think like as women, we're so quick to like throw ourselves out first from the equation and just be like, well, somebody else knows better. And it's ironic because this is one of the biggest things that I worked with college students on, but that persists beyond into all chapters and season. And so whether you're struggling with infertility and trying to figure out what the next right step for you is with your treatments, like trust yourself. If IVF doesn't feel right for you, don't go that path. There's something else there for you. And same with motherhood too, right? Like if your kid's not sleeping and someone tells you blah, 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 blah is the only way, but you're like, that doesn't feel right for me. Trust that there's something else for you there too. So that's my biggest piece of advice. And I think it's universal. It's not just for folks struggling with infertility.
I agree. It's so rare. I can't really think of any example where there's just one right way to approach something, and
Yeah.
everyone's journey is so unique. So I think that's fantastic advice.
Amazing.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Can you tell everyone how they can find you?
Yeah. So the best place to find me is probably over on Instagram. The account is thrIVF, THRIVF, because it's like thrive through IVF. And then my website is also thrivethroughivf.com, and you can find me there as well.
Fantastic. Well, we will link to those in the show notes. And thanks again for joining me. And I look forward to connecting again soon.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.
All right. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to How Long Till Bedtime. To learn how we can work together to improve your child's sleep, pleep and wellnesscoach.com.